All right, I think I am now recording, folks. Greetings. Welcome to the next video I have in my YouTube channel for basically military history, cryodynamics. I'm still trying to better understand what cryodynamics even is. I'm going to stick to that title for now. May change it in the future. But the main point is that we are trying to apply mathematics to military history. That's essentially, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do. We're trying to model military history with some sort of mathematical method so we can gain better insight to the actual conflict. And for those of us who like to use systems, patterns, structures to understand pretty much anything, I think this channel is going to be of great use to you. I know that myself, as a military historian, I have found that probably the overall theme or subject or perspective better that has helped me best understand military history, namely Second World War, all the major operations, has been trying to get a sense of scale of the war, trying to imagine the sense of scale. I remember this must have been when I was younger. I think it was probably around middle school. I think that the numbers that really told me that World War II was way bigger than I realized is when I looked at how many aircraft were produced in the Second World War, and it was literally not just a few hundred, not just a few thousand, but tens and thousands of aircraft, many different variants. All when you combine them together, you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of aircraft that were being produced in the war. And I'm just thinking to myself, wow, that's a lot of aircraft. I've never even seen 1,000 aircraft in my lifetime. Maybe I have by this point. But I've barely seen 1,000. I certainly haven't seen 10,000 in my lifetime. So to think that there was a period in human history where hundreds of thousands of aircraft were being designed to wage war is really impressive. So World War II is really about numbers, I think, in a real sense. If you want to have a clearer sense of the war, at least from a military and industrial perspective, you're going to have to kind of toy around with the numbers. And so this is what this channel is dedicated towards. And I really hope we can make some substantial progress in the coming months as we continue to find ways to use mathematics to model military history. And so basically what I have here in front of you, what I have in front of me right now is a book that I decided to try to break down and try to make sense. The book itself is called Clash of Titans, and this is essentially a overview of the Eastern Front. In fact, I'm actually going to go and grab I actually have a hard copy. All right, here we go. Thank you for your patience there, YouTube. But here we are. This book is David M. Glantz and Jonathan M. House. For those of you who don't know, David Glantz is kind of seen as we'll call him the godfather of Eastern Front military history. He's American. I believe he's still alive today. So, David, if you ever watch this video, thank you, sir, for the work you've done. And essentially, this is just a simple overview of the entire Eastern Front. And I've gone through the book. It's not too long. Most of the written text I think, goes as far as maybe 350 pages, give or take. And then there's a last bit of the book that has all these tables, all these data tables that he's basically put in there. Okay? Of statistics. And in fact, I can even pull it up right here real quick. Let's do that. So I did found an online copy. It's free to download. Here we are. So this book, I'm not here to really use the book directly, and obviously for copyright reasons, I don't want to show really much of the book, but we basically have David Glantz was kind enough to give us data tables, and those data tables I'm trying to make sense of. And I did do a little bit of data science. I took at least one book on data science. And what I've come to realize when it comes to the data of military history of the Second World War is that a lot of the data is just super messy. And for the last year, give or take, this is not the only book that I've read by David Glantz. But I'm trying to do like a David Glantz series, I think. I'm going to start with David Glantz because our YouTube channel is going to focus on the Eastern Front. Okay, the Eastern Front is probably the most fascinating front of the Second World War for me, although the whole war is incredibly fascinating. But I'm going to start with the Eastern Front, especially. I think it takes priority. My goal is to, again, model the Eastern Front to the best of my ability. And so, but before I can even do that, I have to kind of like nitpick at the data I do have and find a way to make it more organized. And so this video is going to be a little presentation I have to just show you all what I've done to help like structure the data a bit. Because the truth is, the data type, if you know any data science, the data types that we're dealing with are just not the good old-fashioned numerical data that most data sets are, that you're familiar with. And so I've had to find a way to sort of structure all the variety of data types. And I've created a Word document here, and it's basically helped me get a sense of, like what are the different types of data. And so here we go. This is my little presentation. Hope you enjoy. So Clash of Titans, complete data breakdown, right? This is, by David M. Glantz. Shout out to David. And what we're trying to do is just try to break down all the different data types. And I looked through the data tables, and this is what I was able to arrive to. First of all, because we're sticking to the Eastern Front, there's only going to be two factions, right? You're going to have data that's going to correspond to Axis data or data that corresponds to Soviet data, right? Stats on Axis units, stats on Soviet units. Pretty straightforward. Now, of course, you could break this down further. The Soviet army is really large. I'm sure you could break it up to like active units versus reserve units. For the Axis, you don't just have German units. On the Eastern Front, you also had Romanian, Hungarian, Italian. You had even Croatian. You had Finnish. You had several other additional groups that were non-German, but were part of the sort of Axis coalition that was built, all fighting the Soviet Union. And so I'm sure we could break that one down further, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to leave it as Axis for now. But just keep in mind that it's predominantly the German Ost here, the Army of the East, and all of its corresponding allies. But then there's also two states that you can find essentially the data. And keep in mind that I'm a military historian, not a historian of war. So my data is focused on things pertaining to the actual conflict, the actual military. And so I think there's two fundamental states that you can find a lot of the data. You're going to find the data of units or troops, soldiers that are alive. And then there's also often you find data of those who are dead, either dead or we can say casualties. Okay, and it's important. That's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference because some data tables or some stats that military historians will give you in their books will tell you, 30,000 troops died at so-and-so battle. And you're like, okay, that's a large number. Let's work with that. On the flip side, you may have so-and-so amount of troops that are, that were assembled before the battle began. 15,000 troops, assembled before the battle began. That would fall under the alive category. So we have essentially two states that you'll find. Maybe I would call them states or even status that you would find in your units, right? You're going to find units that are either going to be alive or dead. Okay, pretty straightforward. Then I also break it down into two sectors as well. And these sectors are general sectors. They don't really pertain to actual region. They actually pertain to the sectors of the war. Maybe even call them fronts. And the way I like to look at it is you basically have the data of military operations, which would be like the war front. And then you have data of the military industry, which I think would be at least some component, a major component of the home front. And, for those of you who studied World War I, World War II, really any war where you had the state of Totaler Krieg, which is total war in German, you're going to find that, a nation that is fighting this like super large war is going to have a home front where the civilian population at home is being affected by the war. And since I'm a military historian, not a historian of war, my focus is going to be on the actual production of tools, equipment, supplies, etc., that are needed to keep the army functioning. And so this is essentially those two sectors. You got the military sector, military operations. This is where the battles take place. It may not necessarily even be the front line. It could be also building a reserve army in the rear, which is very relevant for the Soviet army, because literally as the German army was advancing into Soviet territory, the Soviet reserve stations or reserve sectors, if you want to call them, were being overrun as they were assembling. So, that's the case where you kind of have a bit of both. So that's why I just put it all under military operations. But then we also have military industry. The industry tends to be further away from the conflict. Some sectors were overrun, but even in the case of the Soviet Union, they found a way to pull their industries back. By 1945, Germany, the situation industrially was very messy, very complicated. But the idea is that we can use this methodology for the whole conflict from 1941, which is June 22nd, when the Wehrmacht invades the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, all the way until the Battle of Berlin. I'm really trying to encompass the entire conflict pertaining to the Eastern Front. And so there is a barrier, and I think those barrier is some kind of logistics. I don't really know the exact details of that logistics, but I know that at some point, if you make a bunch of boots or make a bunch of helmets, you make a bunch of rifles, you make a bunch of ammunition, just because you were able to produce it in the industrial sector, it doesn't mean that you can actually carry it over. It doesn't mean that the actual frontline army is going to receive said supplies. There's not a guarantee, and there's often a case, as you'll see in this war, where things are built, but they're not actually being put to use. I think a good example is the amount of aircraft and armor that the Wehrmacht produced in 1944. Their industry kind of peaked in 1944, despite all the bombings and everything. And for some reason, they just simply weren't able to get all those equipment and actually have them functioning at the front line. There's fuel shortages. There was all kinds of problems that the Wehrmacht or the Third Reich economy, Wehrmacht military was dealing with by war's end. But it was some kind of logistics. And I think logistics is really just your basic physics equation, I think work equals, force times distance, right? It's literally the form of just, you could probably even quantify it at some point. Maybe I don't know if we actually will be able to, because we'll be dealing with a lot of data. But the idea is that we're talking about some amount of energy is going to have to be spent in the form of logistics to move that industry supplies from point A to point B, being the military operation sector, if you want to call it that. Okay, so moving along, now we have also a range of territories. This is another type of data, and this data is not really as binomial, as simple as the previous three that we've had so far, but essentially this is the data that's actually going to pertain to geography, right? This is the data that pertains to what you see on the map, the name of a town, city, region. It could be a river. It could be, those are usually the main three. It tends to be a town, a city, a region, or some sort of river, some sort of natural barrier between the enemy and those units. But basically, you have a long list of basically Eastern European regions that encompass the Eastern Front. And so the Eastern Front is just filled with towns. I mean, even if you look at the Russo-Ukrainian conflict today, I mean, I'm sure anyone who studied that, you're constantly learning the name of new towns that you've never heard of, because there's just so many. And the battles, the Eastern Front was such a vast conflict. There's so many towns. And so having some sort of way to manage that type of data set is really important, because it's not just who and what that we're trying to study, it's also where, right? We want to know where these units were at any given moment in time. So the idea is that we need some sort of a data set that can describe the actual sectors or regions is what I'm calling them. Regions is going to be the primary term to describe, where did these battles actually take place? Now, some of the most famous ones that I'm sure my audience will be familiar with, it's going to be the Battle of Leningrad, Battle of Moscow, Battle of Stalingrad, all the major cities. Battle of Kiev was one, or back during this era of Soviet occupation, it was known as Kiev. You also had Battle of Kursk, Battle of Kharkov, and then for more Eastern Front enthusiasts, that you have the Minsk, you have parts of the Baltic states, et cetera, et cetera. But those are just the major cities. There's also a lot of minor areas as well to keep track of as well. Right, moving along, we also have unit classes, okay? And this is really strictly like a military science scripted data set. I'm calling them classes. I'm sure people will call them other things, but they make sense to me to call them classes. Maybe I could have called them unit ranks, perhaps. But basically, for every military, there's a large hierarchy of formation types, right? And, you kind of think of it as fractal in a sense, where you kind of have small units that when you bundle them together, you create larger units. You bundle those units together, you create even larger units. But in essence, this is sort of like I would say the bridge that links the tactical battle to the strategic battle, right? It's just the scale of the unit class that you're speaking of. And so I pretty much did the general class over here. We have army groups at the top, which, as the name suggests, you have groups of armies, clusters of armies. Then you have armies themselves. From there, you're going to have armies are comprised of clusters of corps. Each individual corps is comprised of clusters of divisions. Divisions are usually comprised of some cluster of regiments, brigades, etc., depending on the type of division, whether it's like a panzer division, it could be infantry division, it could be even cavalry division, motorized division. There's many, many different division types, but the general idea is to understand that you have a variety of subunits within divisions. Usually regiments and brigades are the most common too. And then from there on out, I actually forgot one, which is battalions. And then those can break down into smaller groups. Then you got battalions, companies, platoons, squads, teams, and eventually you arrive at the individual soldier. Now, because of the fog of war, chances are we're not going to really focus too much on anything smaller than, I think, a regiment or brigade. You may be able to have a few battalions, perhaps, but my idea is to, since I want to encompass the whole war, we're trying to do like from the division scale. I think divisions are kind of like the basic unit of measurement. I kind of think of them as the basic pawns to the chess game, if you will. They're just kind of a backbone unit. They're like the most common unit. The panzer divisions were very famous in World War II. So I think division seems to be a reasonable size to focus on the measurement of armies, but it also helps to focus on the larger structures. I think if any data available giving, we will have data on some of the smaller structures as well. Not everything is, clean cut. And unfortunately, the smaller scale you go, the less data you have available, because often was the case where you didn't really know the actual field commanders themselves weren't fully aware of the situation. And there was this kind of communication lag that happened on these battles, right? Big communication lag. And so truth is, probably no one will ever fully know what happened in some of these smaller scales. All we have, I think the closest you'll get are primary sources that give you some sense as to what was happening at these smaller scales. And maybe some personal memoirs by individual soldiers, but often those can be biased or skewed because the human perception of a battle can be very different psychologically and so on. So moving along from that, very interesting area, but it's just important to keep in mind that knowing how to class the different unit types is very important. We also now have the names of units, okay? And this is really how the military is from like call it tradition, just the tradition of it, building an army ultimately is simply an organization of people. I mean, even companies today in the United States or anywhere in the West, sometimes they even call like different departments divisions of employees. It's kind of the same thing. You ultimately have an organization of people, and depending on like the prestige of each formation and so on, they would be competing with one another. There would be like all this honor and glory that would go into this. You often had a bunch of what I see as simply just a random random number assignment to these units. I'm not really sure how they number the units, but like you got the 17th Panzer Division, you got the 55th Motorized Corps, you have the 3rd Panzer Army. I mean, the list goes on, right? There's just all these different numbers that are associated to these units. But even though they have a number, the number tells you nothing about. It doesn't give you any numerical insight to that formation. All it gives you is a name. So it is a number system, but it's being used categorically, and so that's why it's called names. Essentially, it's just categorical data. Some units had special names, like the Soviet Guard formations, for example. So we have names. That's another one, similar to classes but different. And then we have the continuous domain of time. I'm presuming I'm going to try to model time in a continuous way. That's a mathematical concept there, basic calculus. I say basic, but it's actually still somewhat hard to understand, in my opinion. But anyways, it's just one of those nuances of mathematics. But it's important to keep in mind how the data is presented when it comes to time. And most of the time, at least what I saw from the David Glantz book, is that you have a lot of a time being measured in hours. You would see an operation start at 08:30 in the morning. You would have an operation that would commence at 1100 hours, and you would see that kind of 100 hours for the operation. So that's kind of like a fundamental part. Anyone who's interested in operations knows that those critical hours at the beginning of an operation are very key. Operation Overlord on the Western Front is probably the most famous for Westerners, but there are many on the Eastern Front as well. And then we also have days, months, years. Some data is only going to encompass, it's only going to link to a full year. So we don't know, we can't break it down further than that. There may be data that only gives you a month, and it may give you an interval. Ideally, I want to have data that could I want to have data for each day of the war. That would be ideal. So that way we can somewhat make it seem continuous, in my opinion. I think a day would be a good unit of measurement. Half a day would be even better. And maybe we could even break it down into the hour, although I doubt we would. But that's that. Basically, domain of time, right? There's a mathematical term for you. Next, we have a range of unit strength. And this is probably the one that most people are familiar with. This is the one that I'm most familiar with, but this is the one in which we're talking about the manpower. How many troops fought in that battle? Battle of Stalingrad, the German 6th Army was encircled. You had, 300,000 troops that were encircled at the time of at the time that the Soviets launched their winter offensive, right? Okay. We also have armor, right? I mean, this is the one that most people are really interested in. How many tanks were destroyed at the Battle of Kursk, right? What else? We have the data of aircraft. That's another big one. How many aircraft were Soviet VVS aircraft, that's the Soviet Air Force, were destroyed in the first opening days of Operation Barbarossa? There's another question. We also have artillery, and artillery is just a general term, but it includes mortars, it includes anti-tank guns, it includes howitzers, I think it includes anti-aircraft, but these are basically the main four so-called unit types that you encounter on the actual battlefield in World War II and pretty much in any other conventional war. But I guess World War I, it didn't really have so much armor, but it still had the manpower and artillery and aircraft. But World War II does expand on the armor significantly, expand on the aircraft significantly as well. So that's why I like World War II so much. That's why I find it so interesting, is because it really was a true combined arms conflict. And these are the main four kind of arms of your army. So this is the data. This is generally the data that we can focus on, but it breaks down from there, right? But generally, we're probably going to leave it at this. But ideally, I would love to know specifically what type of vehicles are being destroyed and so on. But that's it. I probably should have also included the data of trucks, right? I mean, it's not, or maybe soft skin vehicles, right? Non-armored vehicles, right? That's what I'm trying to say. So there's that. Finally, we have there's a range of unit composition, and this is pretty simple, but it just simply tells you like the quantity of each unit class, right? We're not just focusing on the strength, because that is, you're going to deal with numbers in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions. But this is just telling you how many divisions were in the battle, how many corps were in the battle, how many battalions were in the battle, basically how much of each unit type was there. And so it definitely relates to classes, because they kind of go hand in hand. And so that's basically the summary of what I've been able to determine as 8 data categories for the Eastern Front. We have, a data set can tell you, may tell you, what faction that data corresponds to. Is that data going to relate to units that are alive or units that are basically casualties? Is it going to tell you data pertaining to the actual military operations, or is it data telling you about the stats on the industrial sector? Is it going to be data that tells you, will give you any information on the location of units? What part, are they in Poland? Are they in Belarus? Are they in Ukraine? Where are they, right? Are they near Stalingrad? Are they near Moscow, etc.? You're also going to have class of data. We're talking about large armies, or we're talking about small battalions, right? Names of formations. This includes things like, the name of each individual formation type. This is how we're going to gain access to a lot of data. It's going to be very important. Also, just being able to keep track of time. When did the battle take place? Where was this formation at the time of its current other stats? Where was it? What was the date? Was it 1941? Was it 1943? We want to know. Was it in the summertime? Was it in the wintertime? We would like to know. What else? The strength of that unit. How many troops did it have? How many artillery did it have? How many tanks did it have? Etc. I think another cool one to add would be morale, but I don't think we can quantify morale, unfortunately. And then the next one we have is composition, right? How many divisions were in the battle? How many armies were in the battle? How many units were cut off in the siege of Leningrad, etc., etc., etc. And so this is what I have. And the idea is that each of these data categories can be used as a variable. Basically, they're essentially variables. And this is important because we're going to get back to that. Okay, so this is my attempt at trying to structure the data that I've seen. And the idea is that once I create this structure, I can use it for any data set that I come across for any future work. So this is work in progress. Chances are this is going to be updated. It's going to be changed. This is not set in stone, because I'm sure I may come across a new data set that doesn't fit into any of these categories, and I'm going to have to either add one, change one, combine two. I'm not sure. So, but generally, I can tell you now, after about a year of thinking about this, it's taken me about a year to finally get the confidence to actually do this. So I can tell you now, it took me about a day's work to do, but I can tell you now, I'm just really glad that I've been able to do this, because this has been so fundamental to my work. It's like, it really is kind of like the backbone of my work, and it's going to allow me then to expand this work in new directions, and be able to basically study the war at scale. That's part of the goal too. It's not just to focus on one book. If I'm going to focus on the Eastern Front, let's try to use all the World War II Eastern Front books and see if we can, take all the data from all the books and go from there. So that's just the idea that we have. And so, having said that, what else do we have here? I have, what else? So now I'm going to kind of turn into more of a data scientific perspective. Again, I did take a little bit of data science. I have a lot more to learn, as far as data science goes, but it's a very interesting field. And so let's just dive in from what we have. And so, as I've said before, some data is going to be categorical. The faction, territory, the classes of units, and their names especially, are going to be all categorical data. But other data sets, like faction, like the status, like the sector, are binomial. In other words, faction is Axis or Soviet. Status is dead or alive. Sector is military operations or industry. And this can be broken down binomial, meaning that it's binary, right? That's what I'm trying to say. And right now, the way I did it is I signed 1 to Axis, alive, and military operations. I signed 0 to Soviet, dead, and military industry, right? So there's a lot of variety here, but the binomial data is going to be very helpful. And I think breaking it down, trying to make all the data numerical is really like a big fundamental strategy I have, because numbers are easier to work with, I think, or at least in some sense easier to work with once you kind of get past the parts where you have to memorize the numbers. I have some data sets here called elementary numerical data. They're just like obviously numerical. So this includes things like the status, now that it's binomial, sector, it's also going to be binomial. Time, I think, is a little bit more obvious. Strength, composition. I may even get rid of these two. As calling them elementary numerical. But time, the strength of units, the hundreds of thousands of troops in so and so battle, those are, and also the composition, how many divisions are fighting in that battle. That's very clearly numerical data, and it's a spectrum of numbers, right? A range of numbers. But the thing to point out is that all data sets can be transformed into numerical data, meaning that the territories, for example, all those regions that I was speaking of, I can actually use a map coordinate system. I can even use like latitude and longitude if I want, and that's going to be able to quantify all those categorical data, right? The names of regions and so on. I can then convert them all into a numerical data set, and it basically allows the territories now to be quite a scalable data set, and I think that's going to just add to the strength of our essentially our data when we're able to have everything numerical, as I said. Names too. Essentially, yes, you have all these unique numbers for all these unique divisions and formations, but like I can just assign all the divisions that we're operating on the Eastern Front, 0 to in the case of Operation Barbarossa, 0 to 156, or I think it was 152 German divisions invaded the Soviet Union. I can just assign 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 all the way to 152 and just give them that unique number. And in that sense, I don't have to think about their original name. I can just think about them numerically. And again, this is going to help me in trying to scale this type of work. Of course, for us humans, it would be easier to remember the unique formation type rather than calling the 6th Army, Army 77 or Army, whatever army it was. It's easier to just simply call it its name. But I think for the sake of data science, it's much easier to streamline it numerically. Now, these transformations, though, are going to be complex, okay? The map coordinate system does not seem to be a cakewalk to me. I still have an undergraduate level mathematical background. No, it's not going to be the hardest mathematics, but it's not a cakewalk. I think it's going to spend a little bit of time trying to like tweak around and figure that out. But the idea is that is what we can do. It's doable. That's the good news. And then of course, same thing with the naming, converting the naming data into numerical data. Again, I'm going to have to find a way to make that more simple. I think it's going to be complex because we have to keep in mind that a lot of formations were being constantly renamed or reassigned. Subunits would be reassigned to other units, and so you have, in the case of the Soviets, dozens, if not hundreds, of formations that were being destroyed as they were being built, quite literally. So it's like it's one thing to have a case where all the units are alive, but it's another case where you have units constantly being destroyed. They're being changed. Some subunits may be shifting around, and so basically things do start to become a little bit more complex when you consider the fact that different unit types are changing as the war goes on. They're not necessarily constant throughout the war, whether it's a division, whether it's an army, etc. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the other thing to point out, and this is really where I think the magic of this data set, these data sets are going to come into play, but some data categories match more closely with others. And the good example, of course, is the name of a unit and its territory, aka the nth division. It can be any division located at so and so town, right? And that's usually how the military historians present their data. It's going to be in this format. And so it's important that I have that in mind, because as we try to like structure all this data, create a map of all this data, it's important to understand these connections. You may even be able to create functions between different data categories, right? So that's going to be pretty interesting. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that most data is going to be presented in the form of piecemeal multi-category data tables. And so this is, I'm going to get back to that in a moment, but the key takeaway is that the so-called visual shape of the data as it is right now isn't clear. The purpose of my work YouTube channel is to just show you all how can we look at the war in a more wholesome way, in a more systematic way, effectively, and essentially, creating an n category vector space provides an environment to visually map all the data tables. And I call it n vector space because, if you treat each variable as its own unique axis, right? We have 8 data categories, so we're not dealing with 3D space. We're dealing with 8D space as it stands right now. There's 8 dimensions to the space, which I could visually show mathematically someday, perhaps. But the idea is that we want to. The key takeaway is that we don't know the shape, but if we're able to structure the data tables in such a way that they're able to fit this mold, we can actually visually show how do the data tables relate to one another. How does the data within each data table relate to one another? So in a real sense, the mathematics is just providing us a way to look at the war in a different way. What else? So what I've done after that is that we have this large table here. And this table is just a list of all the tables that David Glantz had in this one book. It's just one book that he's had. And you can see here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There's about 24 tables, give or take. And I put in the names of each table. But the thing is that none of the tables really are identical. Some tables have similar structures. For example, tables H through M. You have this theme of Soviet armies being mobilized and redesignated, and then followed by Soviet armies that were destroyed or disbanded. This was for 1942, but then you have the same thing for 1943, again, mobilized or disbanded, or, basically units that were alive, units that were dead. Same thing for 1944 and 45. You kind of seem to combine those 2 years. And then you also had that for 1941. So basically he's broken it up into like a year-by-year basis. I'm about to sneeze. Excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me. But the idea here is that depending on what kind of data table we have, we're dealing with like a unique combination of these so-called categories or variables, if you want to call them that. And the idea is that we want to be able to at least mathematically describe each of these tables, right? Do it in an easy way. So that's basically what I tried to do in this next section here. Again, tables A through R, treating them as if each of them was essentially a unique set of data categories or variables, and then each data table acts as a multivariable function of data categories. And this is what I did pretty much yesterday, and it took me longer than expected, but we were able to do it. And if this is hard to understand, I don't blame you. This is a work in progress. But the idea that I have is that for each of the variables, or for each of the 8 variable types, I'm able to uniquely describe what does each table offer, right? So table A, it actually has both factions. However, its status is going to be 1, meaning that this is only talking about alive units. The sector is only going to be corresponding to military operations, not to military industry. There's a variety of classes, but the time frame is unique. It's only for June 22nd, right? It's not telling me data of the whole war. It's only telling me data of one particular day of the war, right, which is the start of Operation Barbarossa. And then it also gives me information on the composition of forces, right? And anything where you see the dots is basically like just there's a lot of data there. But the idea is that I've been able to create a mathematical structure. Obviously, there's some assumptions in all of this, but it's a nice groundwork for me then to start trying to organize this data. So I'll keep you all updated. I'm going to continue working on just this book, because this is, I think, a good introductory book to start with the Eastern Front. But the idea is that I think a lot of my YouTube videos are probably going to be just me talking about how I've been able to, essentially categorize the data of each book that I come across. And we're going to probably do it one book at a time, right? We're just going to, just do it the good old manual way. But the idea is to work one book at a time, and we can expand on the data sets. And hopefully for any military historians out there, you appreciate my work. If you do, the best way to support is simply like the video, comment below, subscribe, all that good stuff. Help this channel grow so that I can actually make this my primary work. I'm excited about this work. I think this work has some genuine value to the world. So it's simply just a matter of doing it and trusting the process. This is new for me, folks. So if you like this work, please comment below. Please be respectful, of course. Stay safe, and keep fighting the good fight. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video.